This is kind of interesting to look at just because this is Germany's D-Day in some ways. This is what they invested everything in. And so, we talked about earlier, if D-Day had failed for the United States and for our allies, we probably would have had to just sign a peace treaty with Hitler right then and there because we threw everything we had into it and there was no way to recover from it if it failed. So for Germany, they did fail. And that means it's basically um, not a matter of if, but when now. So Hitler's forces were now squeezed not just into Germany, but all the way back into the capital of Berlin on both sides. Hitler, at this point in the war, and this is something we could spend a lot of time looking at Hitler and everything else, if we had the time, but Hitler becomes just delusional at the end of the war. He might have been heavily drugged a lot of the time. It might have been just his, insanity or whatever. But I mean, he was not listening to his generals. He was sending armies that didn't exist to certain places and just refused to believe that certain things were happening, even though they were. And eventually, Hitler's forces are just completely overrun in the east by the Soviet Union. And again, so it's just becoming inevitable here. And so in February of 1945, you see over on the right, there's the big three again, with President Roosevelt in the middle. They have the Yalta Conference, where they get together and they discuss plans for what's going to be done after the war. And this is where we continue to kind of cement our just our beliefs about how we're going to handle things after the war. Because if you remember, a big part of the reason why World War II happened to begin with was because everybody, basically made it about themselves and tried to have the victor get the spoils and all those kinds of things at the end of World War I. And the people that got cheated or the people that got left out, well, they were the people that became the aggressors in World War II. And so this war was horrible enough for the most part that at least the Western powers came to realize that they were going to have to change the way that things were done or we were just going to be in a war forever. And so they're continuing to have that conversation in terms of how things were going to be handled after the war, before the war ends. Let me go ahead and go with this one. Yeah. So lots of things that are really important happened at the end of this war in Europe. That conference we were talking about was one of them. And then Eisenhower, who's the Supreme Allied Commander, and he eventually becomes president of the United States. You can see that we stop our advance here at the Elbe River. Okay. And lots of people have asked the question, why did we not continue to advance to where we were the ones that would get to Berlin and we would have more say-so over what was going to happen with Berlin and Germany in general? But there were some big time concerns. Number one, because Eisenhower was a pretty, a level-headed guy, a man who was a reasonable person and cared about the lives of his men and things. And he knew that, hey, the war was over, and every extra inch that we tried to get, we risked the chance of losing another American life that didn't need to be lost. The other thing is we just didn't know how things were going to go when we ran into the Soviets. As soon as World War II ends, we become arch enemies, and like I said, we have a Cold War within the last 50 years. So he was probably pretty smart in doing this, but he didn't want to run the risk of running into Russian troops and then the war just continuing straight on from there. So we stopped at the Elbe River. That becomes really important when we get to the Cold War later on. So once that happens, what that means, and again, this is important for Hitler too. We stop at the Elbe River. Berlin's back here. Because we stop here, that means that the Russians are the ones that are going to capture Berlin. They had been hoping that it would be us. The Germans were hoping that it would be us because they knew that, we were going to be, just, and that may not be good for them in the end, but we were at least going to be, reasonable about how we handled things. The Soviets had just finished a absolutely brutal war with the Germans, and it was barbaric. And so Hitler and his people knew if they were captured by the Russians, they were going to be maimed, strung up, put out there for display, and everything else you could possibly imagine. And so they all committed suicide in a bunker. And Hitler had his body burned and everything else because he didn't want it being, again, put on display or anything like that. A lot of people have speculated whether or not he continued to survive after that. There's not really a whole lot of evidence on it, but there's that's one of those things people have fun talking about when it comes to conspiracy theories. So immediately after Hitler commits suicide, his subordinates surrender as quickly as they possibly can. And then that's when the jockeying for position and alliances and all that kind of stuff begin. Like I said, almost immediately. The Cold War begins as soon as World War II ends. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking at that later on. Okay. One thing that's important because of our decision to stop, it creates a really interesting scenario with Berlin. It becomes ground zero for that Cold War. Again, we'll talk about that more later. So to finish up, we'll look at the Holocaust.
All right. Words really can't describe what took place across Europe with the Holocaust. The mass slaughter of European civilians, especially the Jews, but you also had other groups that were also going to be murdered, annihilated. Again, words can't really describe what took place. But essentially, the Holocaust is going to take place from about 1941 to 1945. You can see the list of different groups there that were victims of the Holocaust. But essentially, what you have is Hitler's plan of, a Germany, a Europe dominated and controlled by Germany, carried out through the actions of murder. It's important to understand that this was not just Hitler. This was Hitler's ideas, but he had people that were carrying out his vision of that final solution that he talked about in Mein Kampf. So the Holocaust was a process, and it changed. It was pretty fluid. Early on, again, we typically show a video that does a really good job of explaining all of this and putting these words into where you actually can feel a little bit of the sadness that went along with this. But one of the things that this video does is it talks about how this was a process and how it changed over time. Early on, it started off with just mobile killing squads. You had units, like army units, going around to different communities across Europe, rounding people up and shooting them, lining them up, shooting them and burying them, sometimes not even burying them. And then they realized that was not extremely effective, that it was taking too long, it was costing too much, and it was just inefficient. So what ends up happening is they move that into the use of concentration and death camps. One of the important things to understand is that those are two completely different types of camps. Concentration camps is a term that oftentimes gets used with the Holocaust, World War II. And one of the things about that, people sometimes associate them or believe that those were like the death camps, but they weren't. Concentration camps were where they concentrated people together and they used them in kind of as slave labor. They would have them make materials for the war effort, all different kinds of things. Death camps, and you see there in parentheses, extermination camps, that was the specific purpose for those camps. They brought people in, didn't hold them there for very long until they were put to death in a variety of means. And that, again, you've heard of the gas chambers, I'm sure. But people were brought in by train cars to be killed. One of the other things that took place in some of these camps was experimentation. And that might actually be on the next slide. I don't know. I'll let Mr. Denton talk about that.
I think a lot of emphasis needs to be put on this term here, process. There's a lot of fascination in America, I think maybe more than ever, with serial killers. Netflix series, every big one that's out there lately, aside from Tiger King, has to do with some kind of serial killer, serial murder type thing. And the thing about the Holocaust is that it is a mass serial murder that's carried out by a large group of people, which is what makes it so, it's absolutely horrible, but it's also fascinating to look at human beings' ability to do the things that they did. And it's all rooted back in the things we talked about on that previous set of notes. Just like every other situation where human beings are doing horrible things to other human beings, there's a failure to recognize that those people deserve to live, that they're seen as subhumans and things like that. And all that was built in before the killing ever started. So you see this guy over here on the right, Joseph Mengele. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he was kind of the guy that spearheaded a lot of the really, really weird things that were going on in the camp, really awful things. And unfortunately, some of the folks that were marched off the trains and led into the gas chambers and died the quick death. It's awful. It's terrible. There's no doubt about it. But in some ways, those folks could almost be seen as some of the luckier ones, because a lot of the folks who weren't put in those situations were dying these horrible, awful, slow, tormented deaths over a long period of time. And the Germans, again, were just treating them like they were test subjects. They were treating them worse than we today would. We wouldn't want to see animals treated this badly. And you see a list there, some of the things that were done to them just because they could. They put them in pressure chambers to see how long they would last. They tested them with drugs. They did surgery on them without anesthesia. In other words, they didn't put them under. They operated on them without doing that to see, just to see what would happen. They'd strip people naked and throw them out in the freezing cold to see how long they could stay alive. They'd take away organs and limbs and then sew them back up and, see how it impacted them. And they'd put them into, just extreme isolation to see how long it would take them to go crazy. Things like that. And it's, again, it's just a failure of humanity that took place in these things. And you have a huge group of people that bought into what Hitler and Goebbels and some of those guys were selling them. And they like I said, they bought into it, and then they did all these things based off of those beliefs that they developed. And the consequences were just awful, horrible. So you can see here the kind of the end results of the Holocaust. I'll let Mr. Ansmith finish this one off.
One of this video clip here comes from that series we talked about, Band of Brothers. And one of the things, there are a lot of our soldiers that were not aware, and even Americans really, that this was for sure taking place at the time that it was going on. Word just did not travel like it does today. So what you're going to see if you end up watching this video clip at the top there is when our troops discover one of these concentration camps. It's worth the time to watch. But overall, again, these are estimates. They varied, but somewhere around 14 million were killed, 7 million Jews alone. So another side result of that is that you're going to have the Jewish people displaced all over the world. they had to flee. They had to run for their lives essentially. So you're going to have this group of people just displaced all over the place. Eventually, what it will lead to is the creation of the Jewish state, where you're gonna have them. But we'll talk about that a little bit later too. As a result of the Holocaust and those atrocities that Mr. Denton was talking about earlier, we're going to have the Nuremberg trials. You're going to have 23 high-ranking Nazi officials that are going to be tried in court, and they're going to be convicted of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Sentences are going to be ranging from death to life in prison. And one of the things that is still questioned is how much responsibility the German people, just the civilian population, should have for allowing this to happen. It's easy for people to look back and question that. But one of the things that I always try to get across is you don't really know. And if you're not there in the situation, it's hard for you to say, well, I would have acted differently. In the Engineering Evil video that we watch, one of the things that it really talks about early on is how, and Mr. Denton talks a lot about this in civics, when democracy fails and you have these dictators that start controlling what you read and what you hear and what you see, you can become somewhat brainwashed. It went as far as one of the things they did. They created a board game that was similar to Monopoly, that it was a family game, but the object of the game was for you to confiscate Jewish property in this game. So that alone, just knowing that people were buying this game and playing it and not thinking anything otherwise, just one of those small parts that it's hard for us to say, that we would have done things differently had we been there. So that's one of the things that's important about, staying up to date on things, not allowing your democracy to fail, essentially. So I don't know, Mr. Denton, if you got anything you want to add there.
I'd add two things here, and then we'll finish this up. Just that, number one, there's a lot of debate about the responsibility of the German people in that place at that time. One thing that's hard to deny, though, is that the Germans have done a really good job of developing a healthy relationship with their history and understanding what happened there, and trying to make sure that they walk that tightrope of not glorifying it, but at the same time not sweeping it under the rug and learning from it. One of the things that students have to do in Germany to graduate from high school is they have to go visit one of the death camps, so that they can see it, they can feel it, they can know it's there and understand there was a mistake, massive mistake that was made, and it can never be made again. And some people would argue that they've got a healthier relationship with their mistakes of the past than we even do here in the United States. But that's just, it's something that we always need to be looking at and evaluating. I think there was something else I was going to mention, but we're getting long here on the notes anyways. And so we're going to close this one off. There's a second part to this, and we will we'll hit you guys up on that one whenever you're ready. Okay.